The Wink Martindale divorce from the New York Giants is turning into a messy one. Let's go over what we know, what we don't know, and I'll give you some of what I think on this edition of the Valentine's Views podcast here on Big Blue View Radio, part of your SB Nation family of podcasts. Please like, share, and subscribe if you're watching us on YouTube, and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts across the Big Blue View Radio network. All right. We know that on Monday, Brian Daboll fired several New York Giants head coaches. And we know that after some back and forth, after Brian Daboll said he wanted and expected Martindale and offensive coordinator Mike Kafka to return, we know that Martindale reportedly was set to resign his position as Giants defensive coordinator. But we also know that as of Tuesday evening, as I record this show, we know that Martindale has not yet tendered his resignation to the New York Giants. We know that a user on Twitter posted photos of Martindale apparently getting on a flight to Sarasota, Florida, where he apparently owns a home. You know, Martindale apparently has more or less taken his ball and gone home over the situation, as of yet has not turned in his resignation to the New York Giants. So let's try to make some sense of all of this. First of all, I did post some thoughts on this at Big Blue View on Tuesday afternoon. Please stop by the website and give those a read if you haven't done so already. In that column, I made the point that not only the Martindale situation, but the whole situation now with the coaching staff, with several coaches having been fired, including offensive line coach Bobby Johnson, special teams coach Thomas McGahee, two of the assistant coaches, Drew and Kevin Wilkins, from Martindale's staff having been fired, a couple of other coaches, strength and conditioning coach Craig Fitzgerald, and running backs coach Jeff Nixon having moved on to other opportunities. What looks like a mess now on the New York Giants coaching staff as Brian Daboll gets ready for his third season as Giants head coach. What looks like a mess now, you can blame Daboll for it. Don't blame Daboll for it. He's got some culpability, certainly in some of what's going on. Maybe some of it is overblown. We'll get into some of that shortly. But this is Daboll's mess to clean up. And let's be clear about something, as Art Stapleton of The Record has been pounding away at over the last day or so. Brian Daboll is the head coach. Art is correct. Brian Daboll can do what he wants here. If he wants to fire certain head coaches, he can do that. He needs to have the ability to do that. He needs to have the ability to have the coaching staff that he wants to have. If he thinks certain guys are not doing their job to the standards that he wants the job done, then he needs to have the ability to bring in new people. He's the head coach. He can make that decision, and there should be no problem with that. That said, let's talk specifically about Wink Martindale and what's going on here. Obviously, mid-season, we got the report from Jay Glazer that the relationship between Martindale and Daboll was in a bad place. Glazer at the time reported that there was a possibility that Martindale would not last the season. But then what happened was the Giants defense started to play really well. The Giants started to win some games as DeVito mania took off. It quickly became impossible, for Brian Daboll to remove Wink Martindale from the coaching staff if indeed that's what he wanted to do. There was another report from former NFL scout John Middlecoff, who said that there were coaches on the staff under Daboll who despised the man, who didn't like working for him, who were tired of being yelled at, who just didn't like the way that they were treated by the Giants head coach. And I don't know about the truth, about the accuracy of those reports. What I do know is that a younger Brian Daboll was considered to be a very intense person, a guy who didn't always treat people well. What I know is that people who know Daboll have said that he's mellowed over the years, that he's tried very hard to learn to treat people better. That Daboll himself has acknowledged that he was overly harsh at times when he was a younger coach. That he's aware of that. That he really wants to be about, excuse me, about relationship building, especially with players. But I also know this: the NFL is a high pressure business, tons of hours, from early in the morning until late at night. These guys don't see their families very much. High pressure, high expectations. It's a results oriented business. And Brian Daboll, any head coach, needs his assistants to perform well. He needs things done in the way that he wants them done. And he depends on these people to do their jobs. If they don't do their jobs well, then Daboll doesn't have an opportunity to do his job well. There's going to be pressure, especially when losses mount. There's going to be tempers. There's going to be disagreements. People are going to be edgy. When you win, which the Giants did more of a year ago, making the playoffs, winning a playoff game, maybe some of those disagreements can be swept under the rug. But, excuse me, when you lose, those things come to the forefront. They tend to happen more often, and so it's not surprising that some of that stuff would happen here. But, talking directly about Martindale, obviously the Jay Glazer stuff has proven true. The relationship wasn't in a good place. The Middlecoff stuff, I don't know. And I don't know who planted these reports. I don't know where Glazer got this information from. But this stuff is obviously meant to paint Brian Daboll particularly in a bad light. I don't know if it came from someone connected to Martindale. I couldn't tell you that, but it certainly is slanted toward making Brian Daboll look like the bad guy here. Something else that is true is that Brian Daboll doesn't do the media any favors. And because of that, he doesn't do himself any favors in a squabble like this. Daboll gives the media very little. He's a good guy. You talk to him away from the cameras, away from the recorders, away from the day-to-day pressure. He's a good guy. And but he projects a different image. He doesn't give the media any more than he absolutely has to. In fact, he sometimes doesn't really even give us, he gives us less than he probably should sometimes. And consequently, what Daboll does is he makes the media's job harder. He winds up annoying people in the media sometimes for the simple reason that he doesn't give us useful answers to what we often consider even simple questions where where a decent answer wouldn't hurt him. It wouldn't be harmful. It would make it easier for us to do our jobs. On the flip side, Wink Martindale plays to the media. He plays to the fan base. He's always got good quotes. He's always got jokes. He's always expansive in his remarks. He's always got stories to tell. You sit in a Wink Martindale press conference and you always come away with things to write about. You always chuckle. You always you always wind up feeling like he gave you things to work with. And as a media member, you appreciate that. It helps you do your job. So naturally, I think there's going to be some sense of Daboll as the bad guy and Wink as the good guy who's getting wronged here. Maybe some of that is true. Maybe it isn't necessarily true. I I don't really know. I'm not in the room with those two guys all the time, but I think there is this perception of Daboll as the bad guy, Wink as the wronged party here. And maybe that is not entirely true. I think the truth is probably somewhere in the middle. I mean, what happened here on Monday? Brian Daboll sat in a press conference and said that he expected Wink Martindale to come back. He expected Mike Kafka, the offensive coordinator, to come back to the coaching staff. Said they were good coaches, said he appreciated their work ethic, all that stuff. He said that was his plan, was that those guys would come back. But then he very subtly dropped the tidbit that it was early Monday morning. He hadn't discussed their futures with either Martindale or Kafka, which means that what he basically did here was he put the ball in their court. He said he's not going to fire them. He just put the ball in their court. Later on Monday, what Brian Daboll did, which is something, again, which is perfectly within his rights to do, is he fired outside linebackers coach Drew Wilkins and his brother, Kevin Wilkins, who was the assistant outside linebackers coach. Now, the tricky part about that is that Drew Wilkins is Wink Martindale's protege. Drew Wilkins, and by extension his brother, were Martindale additions to the Daboll coaching staff. Their allegiance is to Martindale. Drew Wilkins is a Martindale protege from his days with the Baltimore Ravens. Their allegiance is to Wink, not to Brian Daboll. I don't know for a fact that this is the case, but it could very easily be the case that those guys looked at Wink Martindale as their boss and didn't necessarily look at Brian Daboll as someone that they needed to report to or really listen to. I don't know that to be a fact, but what I do know is Daboll was certainly within his right to fire those two guys. What I also know is that doing that is a direct shot across the bow at Wink Martindale. It was a direct shot telling Wink Martindale that we really don't want you back here next year. The ball's in your court. Go ahead and resign. We're not going to outright fire you, but we're going to make it very, very difficult for you to stay here. So there was a report that Martindale stormed out of a meeting after finding out that the Wilkins brothers had been fired. Again, there was a user on X who posted a photo of Martindale apparently getting on a flight to Florida, taking his ball and going home. And in all honesty, I can't blame Martindale for going home as this situation plays itself out. Martindale's not going to be part of the Giants staff next year. At this point, he's obviously not welcome in the building at 1925 Giants Drive. Why would he want to be there at this point? But Martindale is really kind of playing the only card that he has at this point. He has a contract for next year. If the Giants fire him, Wink Martindale can go anywhere he wants next year and coach anywhere he wants. He could go to the Washington Commanders and be their defensive coordinator. He could go to the Philadelphia Eagles and be their defensive coordinator. If the Giants force him to resign because Martindale has a contract for 2024, the Giants can control whether or not Wink Martindale gets to work next year and where he gets to work. They can deny him the right to interview for defensive coordinator jobs. So that really is the crux of the problem right now. That's why we got a report on Monday that Martindale was going to resign. But that's why, as I tape this show on Tuesday night, Martindale has not officially resigned. There has to be some negotiations, some discussion going on about how this is all going to work, about what Martindale's going to be able to do next year. Is he going to be able to work? Who's he going to be able to work for? Can he get the Giants to tear up that last year of his contract? All of that. So right now, Martindale is playing the only card that he has by holding off on his resignation until he gets some concessions from the Giants in regards to what he's able to do as a coach in the NFL in 2024. If he happens to get an interview for a head coaching job, that is a situation, that's a promotion. The Giants can't stop him from interviewing for that, but they can stop him at this point for interviewing or from interviewing for defensive coordinator jobs. So that really is the crux of what is going on. I'm sure that it'll get resolved eventually, but right now, it's ugly. It's not a good look for Brian Daboll. It's a situation where between the Martindale thing and the offensive line thing with Bobby Johnson and some of the other openings he has to fill, some of that is natural attrition that happens in the NFL. Thomas McGahee was kind of expected to be removed after 6 years as Giants special teams coordinator. Things kind of up and down there with special teams over the years. Johnson was expected to be removed as the offensive line was atrocious in 2023. Excuse me. Still getting over a nasty cough that I've had for about a month now, and sometimes it just catches me, and nothing I can do about it. And I do apologize for the interruption, but we'll keep going. We'll make do the best we can here. But what I was going to say is, I don't know exactly how much you want to fault Brian Daboll for this situation. I don't know how much accuracy there is to reports that he's very difficult to work for. I know if he's difficult to work for, he wouldn't be the first boss on the planet who was difficult to work for. He wouldn't be the first NFL head coach who yelled at assistant coaches. He wouldn't be the first NFL head coach who was hard on the guys who worked for him. That's in a lot of ways, that's par for the course. I know that, Daboll and Martindale, for example, are both alphas who feel very strongly about what they do. I know that, that I've heard, from some people that I know that maybe part of the problem between Martindale and Daboll was the fact that Daboll played defensive back in college at the very beginning of his coaching career, way back around 2000, maybe even before that. Daboll coached a little bit on the defensive side of the ball, but for 20 or more years, Brian Daboll has purely been on the offensive side of the ball. Wink Martindale is a defensive coordinator, experienced veteran coordinator, one of the best in the league for a long time now, guy that's been doing it for a long time. And what I've been told a couple of times is Martindale didn't want to hear suggestions from Daboll as far as defensive suggestions or ideas or whatever. And Brian Daboll's the head coach. Whether he's a defensive expert or not, he's perfectly within his rights to sit in defensive meetings. He's perfectly within his rights to pop into Martindale's office and discuss defensive strategy for that week, to find out what Wink is thinking and offer some suggestions, even if they come from an offensive point of view about, what may or may not work, against a particular offensive scheme. And if that's part of the issue, then, that's just part of the deal when you have a boss. Your boss may not know the subject matter as well as you do, but but he's the boss. He has the right to come in and discuss it with you. And if you're going to bristle at that, then that's a problem. And I don't know exactly, the dynamic between those two guys, but that's part of it. But what I was going to say is, look, Brian Daboll's heading into year 3. Joe Shane as GM is heading into year 3. There can't be any doubt that all of this is within Brian Daboll's right to fire these coaches, to move on, to adjust his coaching staff, to take over play calling on offense next year if that's what he chooses to do. But what all of this does is turns up the pressure on Brian Daboll in year 3. What all of this does is you have a defensive room, for example, and we'll talk just about Martindale. You talk you have a defensive room full of players like Bobby Okereke, like Dexter Lawrence, guys who have been vocal about liking this coaching staff, about liking Martindale, about being happy to work for him. Bobby Okereke the other day called him a great coach, an elite coach. Said that he was a terrific leader. Said that he was, excuse me, said that Martindale was legendary. He talked about how much Martindale has done for his career, since he came to the Giants, and other players have lauded Martindale as well. Kayvon Thibodeau has defended Martindale early in the year when Martindale was criticized for not letting Thibodeau pass rush as much as people thought he should have been pass rushing. Thibodeau's been supportive of Martindale. Other players have been supportive of Martindale. What you have here is a situation where if the Giants don't get the hire right for the next defensive coordinator, if the defense goes backwards next year, if the Giants don't play well, if they're giving up a lot of points, if they're not creating the turnovers that they created this year, I think they led the league in turnovers created with, I think the number was 31. So if things are not going well, Daboll runs the risk of players thinking this would be better if Martindale was still here. This is Daboll's fault that our defense isn't playing well because the coach that we should have isn't here anymore. So there's risk for Brian Daboll. It could blow up in his face. I mean, you look at the offensive line. Bobby Johnson was his hire. If he doesn't get the hire right this time, that's another mark against Daboll as he tries to build the Giants. There's pressure on Daboll as it is heading into year 3. Good year, bad year. You don't want to have another bad year. You want to show progress. John Mara, Steve Tisch aren't going to have patience forever. So I really think that in the end, whatever happens here, however it gets resolved, and although Brian Daboll is absolutely within his right to make these moves, to adjust this coaching staff, the moves that have been made, especially more or less, shoving Wink Martindale out the door here, is going to ratchet up the pressure on Brian Daboll in 2023. That pressure will get ratcheted up even more if Daboll, as some people have speculated, takes over play calling in 2024, which could lead to Mike Kafka, the offensive coordinator, moving on as well. So interesting stuff. We'll see what happens here. We'll be covering everything that we can and giving you all the information and analysis we can about the Martindale situation and about the coaching carousel as well. Let's take a little break here, and then we will talk a little bit more about potential hirings on the offensive line for the offensive line coaching job and potential replacements for Wink Martindale. All right, Ed Valentine here as we continue with the Valentine's Views podcast. We've been talking mostly about the situation between Giants head coach Brian Daboll and soon to be ex-Giants defensive coordinator Wink Martindale. And obviously, the Giants now have a couple of major openings on their coaching staff. The defensive coordinator spot, once Martindale's resignation becomes official, and the offensive line position as well. On Big Blue View the other day, I posted a look at potential candidates to replace Martindale. Among the guys that I mentioned are a couple of Giants assistants, Jerome Henderson, who's the defensive backs coach, Andre Patterson, longtime and highly respected defensive line coach, whose only experience as a defensive coordinator came as a co-defensive coordinator with the Minnesota Vikings a couple of years ago. Henderson is a guy who I think also deserves an opportunity to advance to a coordinator position. But again, that's a job he's never done. So a little bit risky to give the job to either one of those guys. Leslie Frazier, formerly with the Buffalo Bills, has connections to both Shane and Daboll from their time together in Buffalo. There's another candidate. Patrick Graham, former Giants defensive coordinator. If he gets ousted in Las Vegas, where he's the defensive coordinator now, could be a candidate for the Giants job. Brian Daboll thought that Patrick Graham was going to stay on as defensive coordinator initially. Graham chose to leave and go to Las Vegas. So depending on whether or not any bridges were burned when Graham left, he could be a candidate for a return to the Giants. A couple names that I didn't mention, Gerard Mayo, who's with the New England Patriots, could be a candidate for the job. If Bill Belichick is ousted in New England, Mayo could be a candidate. So who knows what's going to happen there? I have also listed Brandon Staley, former head coach of the Los Angeles Chargers, who was a defensive coordinator with the Rams before taking that job, could be a candidate. We'll see what happens. But again, lots of pressure on Brian Daboll to get that job, to get the hire correct, and continue to build that Giants defense and not have it go backwards in 2024. Offensive line candidates, we know that the Giants on Monday asked for and received permission to talk to Las Vegas Raiders offensive line coach Carmen Brasillo about that job. I'm sure we'll hear about a lot more candidates. The big name that everybody wants to talk about at this point is Mike Munchak, Hall of Fame offensive lineman, guy who was Tennessee Titans offensive line coach for a number of years, has worked with the Pittsburgh Steelers, worked with the Denver Broncos, guy who's actually been out of the league for a couple of seasons now, dealing with some physical ailments, but from all reports, wants back in the league. Don't know if Munchak would have any interest in coming to the Giants. He and Brian Daboll do not have an existing relationship that I know of, but I think you have to start there. You have to pick up the phone. You have to call Mike Munchak. You have to see if he's willing to come in and discuss that role. He's really the premier candidate available at this point, so you have to start there. We'll see who else the Giants interview, but and I don't want to sit here and pretend to be an expert on offensive line coaches, because I'm not. But what I do know is that the Giants have got to get that hire right as well. The offensive line for the Giants has been a mess for a decade now. The biggest issue for the Giants the last 2 years, as far as I see it on the offensive line, is that Joe Schoen has drafted 4 players. And to my eyes, those 4 players, Evan Neal, a first-round pick, John Michael Schmitz, a second-round pick this past year, Josh Azudu, a third-round pick in 2022, Marcus McKethan, a fifth-round pick in 2022. You look at those 4 players, and it's hard to make an argument that those 4 players have gotten better, that they've developed, that they're improved from where they were when the Giants drafted them, and that's a problem. When you're pouring resources into the offensive line, you need to see improvement from these players. It's been obvious in the case of Evan Neal that he hasn't improved. Injuries have been problems for Azudu and McKethan. John Michael Schmitz, I think, is going to be a really good player, but John Michael Schmitz played a couple of really poor games at the end of the season that make you wonder, just how much he had gotten better throughout the year. So that has to be a key part of it. Obviously, the Giants will have other personnel decisions to make on the offensive line, but they have to get that hire right. They have to get the defensive coordinator hire right. Those things will be critical for Brian Daboll and for Joe Shane going forward. And as I said, we will give you all of the coverage that we possibly can on coaching staff developments, on roster developments, on free agency coming up. We've already started our draft prospect profile series done by Chris Flum, and we hope that you'll read those. We'll have one each day leading up to the 2024 NFL draft at the end of April. So even though the season is over, the intrigue isn't over, the stories aren't over, there's still a lot to talk about, a lot to discuss, and we'll be doing all of that at Big Blue View. We'll have all of the coverage that you need to follow your Giants throughout the offseason. So please stay with us every day as we find out how the Giants are going to structure their coaching staff, structure their roster, what they'll do in free agency, what they'll do in the draft, and all of that. So with that said, Giants fans, thank you as always for listening. Please stay safe out there. Take care of each other, and we'll talk to you soon. Bye-bye.